Hello and welcome to this new workshop for these knit weave cowl scarves. They are really easy to knit, but we need a few things. We need a lot of stitch markers and optional a few little clamps, but we do need a lot of these kind of stitch markers. Of course, we need our yarn needle, yarn, and a pair of scissors, and of course our knitting machine. The pattern we are going to knit is as follows. You can forget it, but we cast on with scrap yarn 30 stitches, then we are going to knit with color A 40 rows, then 40 rows the loose stripes, and then 40 rows color A, then change color to color B, 40 rows stripes, and 40 rows to finish. But before that you better practice, so watch this tutorial and let's start. I'm going to cast on 30 stitches, in fact 29 stitches, because the 30th needle we cannot cast on. I'm using scrap yarn in the next round also, but a different color. The yarn is under my 29th needle, and now I continue cranking till the first needle comes up again. I take a second piece of scrap yarn and put it into my feeder and knit one round with the scrap yarn. Be sure that you knit correct and that you also knit the 30th stitch. This is the 29th stitch that has the scrap yarn, and the 30th stitch does not have yarn, but we are going to make sure that it grabs our scrap yarn, and then we put that also in the middle. And then we crank further till we have our first needle again, and then we take our working yarn, put it into our feeder, and start knitting flat panel for 40 rows. Make sure your end is long enough. Take your time to knit the flat panels. It still goes a lot faster than knitting with regular needles. And enjoy the knitting. It's very soothing to knit flat panels. So I'm going to knit my 40 rows. I will speed up the video a little bit so that you don't have to wait all that time. Knit your 40 rows of 30 stitches. And I'll see you back when I have finished my 40 rows. I'm finished with my 40 rows of 30 stitches, and I'm going to split my panel into different segments. So for that I'm going to knit 6 stitches. Make sure that every needle grabs the yarn. The 6th needle has the yarn under the hook. Make sure it's the 6th needle. And then you take your working yarn out of the feeder and put it into the middle, making sure that your yarn still is under the hook of the 6th needle. And then you crank until every stitch has passed the feeder and the needle is down. Then you take your stitch markers and start to pick up the stitches from the right to the left. I'm using 6 of each color. Make sure they're open, and it's difficult to show it on video, but you hook your stitch marker on the stitch and take it off the little red pegs. I'm picking up 6 stitches with blue. I'm going to pick up 4 segments of 6 stitches. And the only way I will see the difference is the color of my stitch markers. Now I'm going to pick up the next 6 stitches. And speed up the video a little bit. I'm going to pick up my last 6 stitches. The 7th is the one with the yarn, so it's correct. Now I have 4 different segments with stitch markers. Now I can continue knitting my first segment. I already knitted the first row, so I'm going to knit the second row by cranking in the opposite direction. Make sure the yarn is under that bump left from your last knitted stitch. In the first row we already knitted our 6 stitches, and now we are going to knit our second row. And we are going to knit 40 rows total. I'm finished with my 40 rows, so I have my big piece with all those stitch markers, and I'm going to cut my yarn. I have to attach the next 6 stitches to my machine, so make sure that you use the correct ones. I cut my yarn and take it out of the feeder and put it to the inside of the machine. Then I crank further those 6 stitches until the 7th needle comes up. Then I take my next 7th stitch and put it onto the 7th needle. You can pull on the stitch marker so the loop will get bigger. Crank a little bit further so the needle comes up. Put your stitch around the needle and make sure you slide it down all the way. Then take your working yarn and put it into your feeder between the 6th and the 7th needle. And then crank a little bit further that the 7th needle grabs the yarn. Make sure that it grabs the yarn. Then you take your next stitch marker, pull the loop a little bit and put it onto the 8th needle. And crank a little bit further that the 8th needle grabs the yarn. Grab the next stitch marker, put the loop around the needle, slide it down and crank a little bit further that the yarn is under the hook. Continue till you have put on the 6 stitches on all those needles. Make sure that you slide every stitch down. It has to slide down around the little pegs. When your 6th stitch is sunk, you are going to pick up the first 6 stitches with your stitch markers. Just like we did before, we just pick up all the 6 first stitches on the marker or on the stitch holder. They are very handy. I am going to create more videos with projects with the use of stitch markers. They are very handy in combination with our circular knitting machines. And now I'm going to continue knitting the second segment of 6 stitches. This is my second row, my third row, my fourth row, and you are going to knit 40 rows. I'm finished with my 40 rows. I cut my yarn, take it out of the feeder and put it to the inside. I crank further, and the 7th needle I'm going to put on my next segment. My working yarn I put between the 6th and the 7th needle, and I'm going to cast on and slide down the next 6 stitches. Make sure that every stitch also is knitted with the working yarn. So you have to be aware that you slide down the stitch, put the stitch marker to the inside, and that the needle grabs the working yarn. And that's it. And when you have casted on your 6 stitches, you are going to grab the old stitch markers from the second segment, and then you are going to pick up the second segment with those 6 stitches from your machine. You crank a little bit further that every needle is sunk, and then you are going to pick up those 6 stitches from your second segment. It is a real fast and quick project. And then you continue knitting the second row of your third segment for 6 stitches, and you knit 40 rows in total. And when you're finished with your next segment, you cut your yarn, put it to the inside, crank further without knitting those 6 stitches, and on the 7th needle you cast on the next stitch. You can remove the stitch markers that you don't need anymore because you need them to pick the stitches up. So you have your different segments and you just continue by casting on the 7th needle. Your working yarn has to be between the 6th and the 7th needle. Make sure that the needle grabs the yarn and continue as we did before. Cast on all those 6 stitches, slide them completely down and make sure that every needle grabs the yarn. So the first row is knitted of this segment. And then you crank further till the last 6th needle sank and you start to pick up the stitches of your first segment. And when you're finished, you continue knitting. Make sure that you knit the correct six stitches. And continue knitting till you have 40 rows again. And when you're finished, you cut your yarn, put it to the inside, crank further without knitting those 6 stitches, and on the 7th stitch you start casting on the next segment. Put your working yarn into your feeder and between the 6th and 7th needle and start casting on those 6 next stitches. Slide them down, make sure the needle grabs the yarn and continue. Take your time. Make sure that everything is in the correct place. And knit till the 6th needle sank, and then you start grabbing your stitch holders from the column before and use them to pick up that column. And continue knitting. Make sure that everything is in place. Your next column This is the second row, because the first one is the one that you cast on. And knit those 6 stitches for 40 rows total. Now we have knitted all our loose segments, and now we are going to continue to make it into one piece again. So we are going to connect those pieces back to our machine. First we get rid of those stitch markers, we don't need them there. We need them later on in our project again. And let's continue. We cut our yarn again and put it to the inside. We crank back until the needle before the first knitted stitch rises, because we are going to cast on that needle. For that, we are going to find the next segment and the first stitch of that segment on the left, and we put it under our hook. Don't slide it down, just hook it under the needle, and do that for all those 6 stitches. So we are going to crank further, make sure they're under the hook. Don't slide them down, doing it to this side, just under the hook. When you have put on your 6 stitches of the second segment, you find your third segment. Make sure it's not twisted. Find your first stitch on the left and continue putting all those stitches under the hooks. Make sure that all the stitch holders are on the inside of the machine. And continue putting all those segments next to each other back on the machine. Make sure they are not twisted and that you don't skip a needle. Take your time to do this. That the loops are getting bigger is no problem. We correct tension when we are finishing off our project. We finish at the last black needle or the first odd color needle of your machine. And then we are going to knit with our working yarn. So we put our working yarn into our feeder between the last and the first needle. Make sure that the stitches are completely down when you start to knit your first row of 40. Take your time that every stitch is completely slided down. So be careful while knitting. Take your time. Now we are knitting all those loose ends together to one piece again. And when you have knitted your first 30 stitches, your first row, you continue knitting flat panel for 39 rows, 40 in total, and then you change color and knit 40 rows in the second color. I've knitted my 40 rows and I'm going to change color. So I cut my yarn and put it to the inside. But before I put on my next color, I'm going to remove all those stitch markers because I'm going to need them soon. And now I'm going to start knitting with my second color. I'm going to put it into my feeder and between the last and the first needle of my machine. And I'm going to knit 40 rows again. And now we are going to knit our 5 columns. So I'm going to start with knitting 6 stitches. Make sure that the yarn is under the 6th stitch. And we're going to repeat again what we did before. We knit further without yarn. And we start taking off our stitches per 6. And we do that 4 times. And then we start knitting again. We crank back until our yarn comes to our feeder. We stick it into the feeder. Make sure it's connected correctly under the bump. And then knit your second row of your first column, those 6 stitches, and your third, and you are going to knit 40 rows again. And when knitted 40 rounds, you cut your yarn and you crank further without knitting. Make sure that everything is in place. We are going to take it off the machine, and then we are going to continue knitting the next columns. But first we have to take this one off. So cranking further without knitting, and then I'm going to take my stitch holders. I'm going to knit a little bit further so it's more easy for me to pick the stitches up with my stitch markers. And I pick them up, all 6. And now my project is off my machine. I'm going to cast on the next 6 stitches. I'm going to cast on from the left to the right, so I find my 6th stitch. And I'm going to start with casting on from left to right. Only hook it under your hook. That's easy. Only those 6 stitches. And when you have them all, you take your working yarn and put it between the last and the first needle and start knitting your first row of 6 stitches of this column and continue knitting until you have 40 rows on this column, and then take it off the machine again. And when you're finished, you cut your yarn. You knit further without knitting. And take this column off the machine with your stitch markers. And then continue for your next column. You repeat all the steps for the next 3 columns until you're finished and your work is of the machine complete with 5 loose columns. And then your work should look like this. Make sure it's not twisted, and then we can start to weave. Take the first column that's next to your columns of the opposite side, and we simply start going over, under, and over. Then we take our second column and we go under, over, over, and under. And then we take a stitch marker or a little thing like this, and we stick them together so they don't get loose. And then we take our third one, and that goes over, under, under. And then we stick them together to the second one. Then we take our third one, under, over, make sure nothing twists, under, over, and under, and connect those 2 ends also. And then go with the 5th one over, under, over, and then you connect them also together. Make sure that your weaving is okay, and then you take your machine again. We are going to put our work back on the machine. Find your 30th needle and take your work. Put it inside the machine and make sure that you start on the left with the right side facing to you, and then stick the first needle under the hook, and you start to continue taking up all those stitches from the left to the right only under the hook and make sure that the stitch markers are facing to the inside. And then when you have done your first 6 stitches, you find your second column. And then the first stitch on the left from that column. Take your time and start putting those 6 stitches under the hook. I skip a stitch, I see now. I have to correct that. Skipping stitches is not the loops will get bigger. That's not a problem because that's good. You continue putting all the 30 stitches onto your machine. Make sure nothing twists. And your last stitch will be on the first needle of your machine. And then you are putting your working yarn into your machine between the last and the first needle. And then we are going to knit the first row. Be aware that you carefully look at every stitch, that it's completely slided down, and help it when needed. Take your time to knit this first round because it's a pity when you lose your stitches now. It's not complex, just take a good look at every stitch and take your time. And when you have knitted all those 30 stitches together, you continue knitting rows. And you have to knit 40 rows. And then we are almost finished with our project. And when we are finished, you can put your working yarn into the middle when you want to use it for a border or something. And then we are going to knit one row with scrap yarn. When we have knitted all the 30 stitches, we put our scrap yarn to the inside. Then we crank further a whole round and make sure that every loop is completely slided down the needle. And then we are going to cast off with another piece of scrap yarn into your yarn needle, as you are used to cast off. We are finished with our knitting machine now and ready to complete our project. We have to tuck away a couple of ends, and we have to get out all our stitch markers. To make it into a cowl, you have to join those two ends together, seamless. That's why we use the scrap yarn. And then you have a seamless cowl. You can also choose to close the two halves, but I don't think that's necessary to close them because I like it when it's like this. The finishing off of all those ends, you see that the tension is not all the way the same, but you can easily correct the tension by just simply pulling on the tails. Look, when you pull, you will see that they will close the work nice. And then you just simply, I just use a half knot around my needle. You just simply secure your ends, and I like to stick them through the columns. Just weave them through a couple of stitches. Because they roll, the end will disappear in the edge. And you do that with all the ends of the columns. Correct the tension by just pulling, and then secure the ends and tuck away in the column. Take a few minutes to do this. It seems a lot of work, but it's not really. So, continue for all your columns. And this is what it looks like when you tuck away all those ends. I'm going to make it into a cowl scarf, so I have to close the edge by just making a nice crochet border. I can easily find the stitches because I have used contrasting scrap yarn, and I'm going to knit crochet. You can continue crocheting a border, but I don't do that. I'm going to make tassels. So now I will show you how the scrap yarn works. I'm going to pull one out, just pull it out, and then I'm going to pull out the second one. Ta-da! And I have a nice edge. It will roll, and making a border or tassels will prevent that. I'm going to tuck away these ends. And one end is finished, and of course I'm going to do that for the other side also. I like to show you again how to remove the scrap yarn from your knitting by just pulling out those two ends. It's brilliant. I'm going to put tassels on them, so because now they are rolling and I don't like that, so I'm going to put tassels on. I cut pieces of yarn. I skip one stitch. I stick my needle in, take 3 pieces, and that's a tassel. Skip one, take 3 pieces of yarn, pull through, and pull those ends through, as that's how I make my tassels. It's quick and it's working against the rolling border. So, and that's how you make these scarves, the cowl and the cowl scarf. I hope you like this workshop. Give me a thumb up, and if you want to see more, subscribe. And thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye, with love from Holland.